Hello and welcome to Language Secrets. We're looking at the hidden connections between languages, the secret links between words that sound and look very different from one another, but that have links between them nonetheless. Essentially because these are methods to help you understand a bit more and remember better.
Yes, you join us in the music shed at Gallagher Acres because it's one place you can definitely record a conversation properly. We enjoy discussing this stuff. Take, for example, the French verb écrire, to write. If you had to learn that word, it might never occur to you in a month of Sundays to link it to our word scribble as a way of remembering it, but that is exactly what you could do. They both started out from the same root. Essentially, they both used to be the same thing.
Our word scribble doesn't look or sound anything like the French word écrire. Not at all. But if you take the root of the word from the Latin, you find the word scribere, and that does link much more closely with our word scribble. Same thing in Italian. It's even closer than our word scribble. In Italian, to write is scrivere. It's basically the same word as the Latin. What becomes trickier is when you start looking in French and Spanish and how the word has migrated into those languages. There are links there, but they're harder to spot.
Yes, in both Spain and France, when they were confronted with a Latin word that began with an SC sound, what we could call a compound consonant, they found that it just would not trip off the tongue. And what they ended up doing to get along with the Latin word was to bolt an extra syllable onto the front of the word. And they used an air sound, represented by the letter E. So in Spanish in particular, you will find lots of words that begin ESC. So in Spanish, scribere became escribir.
In French, they actually did something kind of similar to this, although you might not know it from looking at the word. They took this same helper e sound at the front of the word that the Spanish do, but did something that's quite typical of French by getting rid of the S totally, instead just keeping the E and the C. So take the word scribere, they got rid of that S but added an E on the front. You might expect to find something a bit like écribir, which over generations and over time rounded off simply to écrire.
What's really helpful to know here is that these particular changes are things that went on again and again and again. Take a Latin word connected with school, for example, scola. In Spanish, you expect to find that helper E, the e syllable, and sure enough, in today's language, you have escuela. In French, you expect to find that helper e sound, but without the S there, and sure enough, in French, you have école. And by the way, we will put all of these details into the written notes in the description box.
It's not just the words that begin with SC in Latin that followed this same pattern. Words beginning with ST did the same thing. If you take the Latin verb to study, which is studere, in Italian that became studiare. In Spanish, they again used that helper e sound and it became estudiar. And then in French, they did the same thing, got rid of the S, and it became étudier.
Take another compound consonant, SP, and the word spirit, which in Latin is spiritus and in Italian is spirito. In Spanish, you look for that helper E, and sure enough, you get espiritu. And in French, actually, this is one where they used the helper E and they kept the S in, their word being esprit.
The English language was happy to lift these words a bit more directly from the Latin or from the French without having an extra syllable at the start, without adding that extra e sort of sound on the front. We're happy to say school, study, scribble, and words like that.
There are one or two examples where we have pulled those words in, maybe from the French or the Spanish, and we've got the helper E, like especially or estate. But interestingly, almost always, we have got a parallel word which doesn't have the helper E's. So specially and state. Estate means one thing, state means another. Especially and specially. It's part of the richness of English that we can do it with or without.
These patterns are interesting, sure, but they're also practical. If you take a word in Spanish, for example, that starts ESP or ESC, you can reverse engineer it, if you know the pattern, to figure out more or less what it means. Let's take the word escaldar, for example. Knock off the first e syllable and you get something that's a bit more similar to our word scold. Or the Spanish word espada, knock off the first syllable, you get something a bit more similar to our word spade.
In French, you can do the same thing, but you do have to try a little bit harder. In French, there are loads of words that start with an initial e syllable, perhaps with a little accent aigu on the first e, and then they go into a letter such as a T or a P. And very often when that happens, you can say to yourself, right, we can reverse engineer this. So you knock off that E, but you have to add back in the S that the French will have got rid of. And then, for example, following those rules, you can see that école is essentially our word school. You can see that état is bringing you very close to something like our word state. You have
étranger.
Étranger, yes, very neat example, because you apply these rules, get rid of the E, stick on the S, and you're looking exactly at our word stranger. Épouse, same thing there. Get rid of the E, put the S back in that the French will have got rid of, and you're looking at spouse. And actually my favourite, épicier. Get rid of the E, stick the S in, and you're looking at a word very closely connected to our word for spice. Épicier, a grocer, somebody who sells spices.
So talking about French getting rid of their S's in their words, they do that a lot. They either do it in both the written and the spoken word, or quite often they'll keep it in the written word but they don't pronounce it, like in the French word for Paris, Paris. It's got the S on the end, but you don't say it. But sometimes when they do this and they get rid of the S in the written word, they leave a helpful clue to show that they've done it in the form of a circumflex accent. Like, for example, take the French word hôtel, okay, it's not got any S in, but if you add an S in, it looks a bit more like the English word hostel. Or hôpital, okay, a really obvious word to look at and use this as an example for. Hôpital, add in an S, it is exactly the same word as our word hospital. You've got château, add in an S there after the A, comes a bit more like our word for castle. And then finally, côte as another example, add in the S there, and suddenly it looks a lot more like the word for coast.
It follows from all of this that we're saying that French has migrated farther from the original Latin homestead than the other languages have, whereas Italian has actually stayed closest to the Latin, which is no surprise at all really when you consider the geography. And a result of this is that when you're confronted with French words, you've just got to try that little bit harder to work out what the connection is to some other Latin type word, which is going to be more familiar to us, quite likely.
Take as an example the English word feast. The Italian is very similar, festa, the Spanish, fiesta, and then the French take it a little bit further. It's a little bit less recognizable and it becomes fête.
It's one of the pleasures of delving into the roots of English that we can trace the roots of our language in many different directions. So we're basically a Germanic language, and you have so many of the grammatical structures of the language, the verbs and so on, are coming from the East, basically, from Germany and from Holland and from Scandinavia, countries like that. But so much of the word stock is also essentially Romance. It's coming from the Latin, or it's coming from the French and the Spanish. So you can trace these other roots going under the Channel and down across towards the Mediterranean, going through linguistic tunnels under the Pyrenees and so on, all part of the pleasure of looking at these European languages from an English point of view.
So that's enough talking about words beginning with compound consonants in Latin. Have you got a fact for us to finish on?
A fascinating tidbit.
Exactly.
Yes, I discovered not very long ago an interesting detail to do with the Spanish word quizás. Curious little word that crops up meaning perhaps or maybe. I always thought that's not a very Spanish looking word. I wondered if it had come from the Arabic or something. And I read the other day that it's a modern rendering of an old Spanish phrase, qui sabe, meaning who knows. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I read that, I thought, of course, quizás is very like qui sait in French. And you stand back and you think, actually, they're scarcely like separate languages. They're more like French and Spanish, for example. They're really like sister dialects of some bigger language rather than completely separate languages in their own right. You just have to know what you're looking for to spot the connections, really.
Interesting.
We will get around to talking a bit more about Italian than we have done here, and we'll bring Portuguese in, at least to some extent. One of the problems for the amateur linguist is that Portuguese is particularly challenging when it comes to pronunciation, but we'll find a way around that. Essentially what we're doing here is refusing to stick to our silos. We're deliberately going outside our lanes because the danger is that otherwise you just pigeonhole yourself into thinking, I only really know one language or two languages or whatever it is. The reality is that because of these connections, you know more than you think you know.
Thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed. Like and subscribe, and remember that we've got our notes in the description below. Share it with anyone that you think might find it interesting. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.